In the last video, we discussed exactly what a reducer is, or at least some high-level notes on it. So now in this video, we're going to flip back over to our square screen component right here, and we're going to start to refactor it to use a reducer instead of these separate, independently managed state variables. So in general, anytime we make use of a reducer, we're either using a reducer to manage our state, or we are using this useState hook thing instead, one or the other. We're not going to have any scenario where we have identical variables being managed by both useState and reducer. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to first start to clean up my square screen component. Specifically, I'm going to go through here and delete everything related to our current management of state. So we're going to essentially write out all this useReducer stuff from scratch, entirely from scratch. I highly recommend you do the same and delete this code along with me. If you want to keep a backup of everything we've written so far, you can always create a duplicate of the squarescreen.js file. Okay, so let's start doing a little bit of cleanup. We're going to delete everything related to state inside this component right now. So I'm going to first find square screen. I'll then take these first 3 lines, I'm going to highlight them and delete them. After that, I'm going to highlight the entire setColor function and delete that as well. And then I'm going to go through all of my onIncrease and onDecrease callbacks right here, and I'm going to delete the setColor call inside of each of them. I am going to leave behind the arrow function you see right there, but I'm going to delete just setColor and its arguments. So we'll delete setColor, delete that. There's 3, 4, 5, and 6. And you'll notice that I've got some syntax errors here because we have some arrow functions without a body. That's totally fine. We're going to come back and fix these up in just a little bit. Okay, so now back at the very top of the file, we can start to add in our code to use a reducer inside this component. So the first thing we're going to do is find line number 1 right here. Rather than importing useState from React, we're going to delete that, and instead we're going to import a different hook function, one called useReducer. This useReducer is a hook function, very similar to how useState is a hook function as well. Remember, a hook adds in some additional functionality or some additional capability to a functional component. So we're going to use useReducer to add in the functionality to essentially use a reducer inside of our square screen. Let's first take a look at how we call this useReducer function. So inside of square screen, I'm going to write out some syntax that looks rather similar to useState. So I'm going to say const, I'm then going to place those square brackets, and I'll say state, dispatch, then my equal sign, and I'll call useReducer. I'm going to pass in a reducer function. We are about to write this. We have not created this variable yet. This is going to be the reducer function you and I put together. So I'm going to add that in just a moment, but for right now, I'll add in the argument right away. Then as the second value, we're going to put in our initial state object. So this is very similar back to this diagram right here. Remember, we said that we're going to have one object that has all of our state in it. Remember back when we were using useState just a moment ago, when we called useState, we had to put in an initial value for each different value. So very similar, when we make use of reducer, we have to provide an initial value for our state object. So this is where we're going to essentially set the tone for what our state looks like. In our case, I think that we should have an object that has a red property that'll start off as 0, a green property that starts off as 0, and blue that starts off as 0 as well. Okay, so now right away, we can immediately see that we've got one variable right here called state. State initially is going to be exactly equal to that object. This state variable is going to essentially be how we access our different state values. So before we had those 3 separate different values floating around of red, green, and blue. Now instead, they are all combined into this one single object. So once again, just to be really clear, if we were to do a console log of state right here, when our component is first shown on the screen, we would see inside of our terminal that object right there. So that's our starting initial value of state. Okay, so now that we've set all this stuff up, we now need to just do one other thing, believe it or not. We have to define our reducer function. So I'm going to define my reducer function right above my useReducer call. So I'll give myself a little bit of space up here, and I'll define a new function called reducer. Okay, Now, technically, we can define this function inside of square screen, but usually by convention, we define it outside of our component. And the reason for that is that, remember, argument number 1 to our reducer is going to be our current state object. That's what argument number 1. It's our object that has all of our different state inside of it. If we define our reducer function inside of square screen, we will want to refer to that first argument right there as state, because that is going to be our state object. But if we have that argument right there that's called state, it'll be very quickly confused with this other declaration of state over here. Now, technically, this would not result in an error, but it's going to make life for you really confusing, because you're going to have essentially 2 different variables called state floating around it inside of this one component. So in general, I recommend for you to define the reducer function not inside of your component, but just maybe right above instead. It's going to make your life just a little bit easier. Okay, so now let's continue with our reducer function. Again, our first argument to it is our state object. So our state object is that thing right there, red, green, and blue. Our second argument to it, so this is argument number 2 that we just saw inside that diagram, is going to be the object that describes how we're supposed to change our state object. It describes the update that we want to make. So it would make a lot of sense to call that second argument something like how to change state object. But that's a really long name. Usually by convention, we instead call that second argument action instead. So the word action really means, and what you should really think of it, is how should we change our state object? What change are we making? Are we increasing red or decreasing it? Are we increasing blue, decreasing green? What are we doing? That's the job of the second argument. If you see the word action, just think to yourself, this is an object that tells me how I need to change my state object. So now inside of here, we're going to inspect that action object and make some change to our state object using it. We usually do this by writing out a switch statement very similar to the one that you just saw inside of our setColor function. Before we worry about writing out that switch statement, however, I just want to reiterate and put down some comments inside this function to remind myself exactly what state is and what action is. So right here, I'm going to say that state is going to be equal to an object that has a red property, that's a number, green, that's a number, and blue, that's a number as well. Now notice this is not really valid JavaScript right here. This is just a comment to myself to remind me exactly what that state object is. I'm also going to write out a comment for action as well, once again, just to remind me exactly what it is. So you and I get to define exactly how we pass in this action object or what properties it has. So I think that right now we should plan on that action object having some property like color to change, and that will tell us what color to change and how much to change it by. So like a number of 15 or minus 15 or whatever. So I'll add in a comment here. I'm going to say that the action object is going to have a property color to change, and that's going to be red or green or blue. It will also have an amount property, and that will be something like positive 15 or negative 15. Again, this is not necessarily valid JavaScript right here. This is just a comment to remind myself what that action object is going to look like. All right, so now we can write out that switch statement. So I'm going to write out switch, and then we're going to switch over action.color to change. Very similar to what we just had a moment ago inside of our setColor function. So I'll do action.color to change. So there are 3 different possibilities of what color to change is going to be, either red, green, or blue. So we'll write out those 3 cases. Case red, case green, case blue. We should also technically have a default case on here as well. The default case is going to handle the case in which we accidentally throw an action inside of here with like maybe a invalid color to change or a undefined color to change. It's not extremely likely to happen in this application you and I are putting together, but usually by convention, we nonetheless add in this default case, just in case we have not added in an appropriate case switch or case handling statement. All right, so now just like our setColor function, inside of each of these different case statements, we're going to inspect our action object once again and use that to decide how much we want to change our given color by. Now for right now, we're just going to ignore doing our validation step. I'm not going to worry about decreasing red underneath 0 or above 255, and similar for green and blue as well. We're just going to say, oops, if we change it by too much, oh well, We'll come back in a little bit and add in that validation logic. Okay, so now inside of here, we're going to decide, we've essentially gotten to the point where we've realized, okay, we need to modify the red property of our state object. Now here's the one catch. Remember technicality number 1 right here. We're never going to change argument number 1 directly. So inside of this switch statement, you and I are never going to do something like state.red equals state.red minus 15. Remember, we saw something very similar back when we were using our useState hook. We said that we're never going to modify our state values directly. So same thing inside this reducer. So that might make life a little bit challenging. You might be thinking, okay, well, with the useState hook, we had this setter function to make our changes, and that made life pretty straightforward and easy. So how are we going to make a change in this case? Well, essentially, anytime that we want to change a property inside of our state object, we're going to rebuild that entire state object from scratch. So we're going to take this state object right here, we're going to rebuild the entire thing into a new object, but the new object is going to have the changed value for red that we want. So let me show you how to do that. We're going to write out return, curly braces, ... state. Then we'll write out the change that we want to make. So I want a new value for red. And I want that new value for red to be state.red plus action.amount. So take the current value of whatever red is and add in however much we specified on that action object. So what's going on with the syntax right here? Well, this essentially means make a brand new object. So that's where we are assembling a new object. We're then going to take all the existing properties out of our state object, and we're going to essentially copy paste them into this new one. Then we're going to overwrite the existing red property. And the new value for red will be state plus red plus action.amount. So with this code right here, we are not making any change whatsoever to our state object. Instead, we are copy pasting all the values out of it, adding them to this new object, and then making a change to the new object. So no change has been made to the original state object, which is exactly what we want. We don't want to make any change directly to state. Now to visualize this syntax a little bit more easily, here's what's really going on. We can kind of imagine, let me do a quick copy paste here. We can kind of imagine that with this ... state, that essentially gets changed at runtime into something like this. So again, with the ... state, we take all the values out of state, which is red, green, and blue, and we essentially copy paste them into this new object. So that includes the red property. But now we've redefined red to the right-hand side of the existing one. When we redefine a new property like so, later on inside of an object, it overwrites the existing one. So essentially, this red of 0 right here gets deleted, and we end up with just green of 0, blue of 0, and red of the new value. So that's what's really going on with that syntax. Okay, so now we've seen how we can update a state object without technically changing the state object. So now we will repeat this process for case green and blue as well. So I'm going to copy paste that down twice. On green right here, I'm going to change the key of red to green, and I'll change state.red to green as well. Same thing for blue. So I'll go to blue and state.blue. Now, once again, very much like I complained or asked you with the set color function, please triple check. Make sure you've got case red, green, blue, and then you should see red, red, green, green, blue, blue. Now, finally, for our default case right here, if we did not match any of these different cases, that means we don't want to make any change to our state whatsoever. So in the default case, we're always going to return the state object. Okay, now I want you to notice something inside this reducer. Our reducer now conforms to technicality number 2 right here. We are always going to return a value to be used as argument number 1. We've returned our state object no matter what from our reducer function. So whenever we call this reducer function or whenever it gets called by React automatically, in every scenario, no matter what, we are always returning a new object to be used as our state. This is slightly different than the setColor function we were working on a little bit ago. In setColor, we were making use of those setters. So in this case, when we make use of reducer, whatever we return from this function will be used as our new state object. Okay, so this is our reducer in total for right now. Now this video is running really long, so I'm going to save this. We're going to take a quick pause right here. When we come back the next video, we're going to wire all this back up to our square screen component, and we're going to see everything actually work. Believe it or not, we just have to make like a couple little additions and everything is going to be working just how it did a moment ago. So quick pause, and we'll resume this in just a moment.